So Israel has said it was targeting Nasrallah with these strikes. To what extent should we expect the retaliation Hezbollah could deliver in response will be different in nature, depending on whether or not Israel was actually successful in taking out the leader?
Well, this is a momentous event, of course. Hezbollah is the A-team of terrorism and has been for decades, and Nasrallah is really an extraordinary force behind that terrorism. We don't know, of course, what's happened, and we don't know what Hezbollah's response will be. But what's notable is that they have been on the back foot now in response to Israeli operations for 2 weeks. There's been, of course, this series of attacks on their command and control structure, culminating in this attack. And I think it'll be very hard for Hezbollah to determine what kind of response to take. They have not wanted to escalate beyond where they are. They'd like to control the escalatory ladder, but now Israel is in charge of that. And I think Hezbollah will be at odds and ends trying to sort out what to do next.
Ambassador, what do we know about Hezbollah's ability to respond right now, given this attack?
Well, they have accumulated massive amounts of missiles and drones and other sophisticated equipment that goes well beyond what we saw in the last war, major war in 2006, as have the Israelis. But they have only used it up to a point because there has been, I think, a desire to try to maintain, as I said, their hand on the spigot of violence. And I don't think that they determine it to be in their interest to escalate too far because they know what the Israelis can do, as we have seen. Without their very charismatic leader, the tried and true and experienced Nasrallah, I think it'll be very hard to see what they're going to do. It's an organization with deep-seated bench and a strong rank and file, but they are going to be, I think, at a very difficult spot now, and I think will have a hard time figuring out what to do. And so I think the Israelis, in turn, will continue to keep the pressure on and continue to escalate.
Well, it's one thing for the Israelis to have a difficult time guessing what Hezbollah is going to do. It might be another thing entirely, sir, for the U.S. to guess what Israel is going to do, because the Pentagon said today the U.S. was not told in advance that Israel was going to be conducting this operation. That's something I spoke about on the earlier edition of Balance of Power with Hagar Shamali, formerly of the National Security Council. And this is what she told me, and then I'll ask you a question.
If you look at similar assaults like this or attacks in Israel's history, they don't always give the U.S. a heads up when they've been targeting terrorist commanders and so on, things like that. They don't often, because these are very sensitive operations. Often they have to verify for sure that their target is in fact there. And then sometimes those decisions are made within minutes. Sometimes they take longer, but often minutes. But also on the U.S. side, they're worried for a leak. And if a leak happens, that target moves and they lose the opportunity the way they see it.
So, Ambassador, even if there is historic precedent for not informing the U.S. of all operational decisions Israel is making, considering this strike happened as the U.S. is actively, publicly pushing for Israel to come to a near-term ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah of about 3 weeks, what does that say about the Israeli government's consideration for the U.S.'s thoughts on this conflict?
Right. I mean, it's true. In fact, most American presidents don't really want to be asked because they don't want to be put in the position of having to say yes or no. But what I think, to your question, the bigger story here is that the United States has had difficulty establishing relevance over the last year in having its will respected by either Israel on the one hand or the other adversaries on the other hand, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran. And they've offered a series of diplomatic approaches that have not really been taken seriously by anybody because they don't meet the needs of the moment. They're based on old realities rather than the new realities of the Middle East since October 7th, which starts with a never again mentality in Israel. So unless the United States can offer a diplomatic approach that offers real, tangible, new security and stability and deterrence on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, Israel will continue to do what it feels it has to do on its own. And in fact, the truth is they are, for the first time, finally reestablishing deterrence through these kinds of attacks on the command and control structure at Hezbollah.
Ambassador, you bring up an important date, October 7th, and the one-year anniversary of that is coming up in just a little bit over a week. How does the significance of that date weigh on both Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel as they're all deciding what to do next?
Well, I think for Hezbollah, this entire conflict was a gratuitous war of choice, a voluntary war to join based on Iran's interests rather than any Lebanese interest in piling on to Israel. I also think it was just a matter of time that once the Israelis had felt that they completed more or less their operations in Gaza. So now it's more of a stability-based operation in and out. They've more or less done what they can do militarily, that they would turn their attention to the north and the unfinished business that was presented by Hezbollah. And I go back to that never again mentality, that threshold moment of October 7th. Netanyahu and his coalition have to decide whether and when to send 60,000 Israeli civilians back to the northern border area. And they're not going to do that unless they're absolutely confident that there aren't going to be attacks the next days or weeks or months from the north.
Well, Ambassador, you just suggested something interesting, which is in your view that Israel seems to be signaling it is mostly finished with its operations in Gaza, and yet Israel will not agree to a ceasefire there, despite the presence still of the remaining hostages being held by Hamas. If they are mostly done with that fight, moving on to this different front, why not just accept the ceasefire that Hezbollah says, if you stop the fighting in Gaza, will stop targeting Israel's north?
Well, what I meant to say really is that the heavy thrust of the military operations in Gaza have more or less done whatever it is it can do. And I think Israel wants to maintain, doesn't need a ceasefire because of that fact, and wants to maintain a free hand operationally because there are still hostages being held, and they are going to need to continue to go in and out because the area will be very insecure for quite some time in the absence of any kind of governance structure or reconstruction infrastructure. We haven't seen anything developed along those lines. So they still want a free hand in the south. I'm just saying that they now have and the Israeli leadership themselves have said this, Defense Minister Gallant, the focus of attention has shifted now to the north.
The risk of escalation has always been the question that's been behind every single development in the Middle East over the past year or so. What is the risk right now that this really does escalate quickly? You know, Iran gets directly involved, or perhaps the U.S. sees a need?
I think the Iranians would be very reluctant to get directly involved. The last time they got directly involved was after their commanders were killed in Damascus, and it didn't go very well. The Israelis and their neighbors and the United States prevented the missiles and drones from entering into Israel. So I don't foreclose that completely, but I don't see it as very likely. I think what we will see, by the way, is the potential for terrorist attacks anywhere in the world in weeks and months to come. That is Hezbollah's specialty. You'll also see sectarian violence potentially, at least tension in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shia Muslim group. The country is divided amongst many different communities, including Sunni Muslims and Christian Muslims. So a primary focus of Lebanese leaders will be trying to absorb that and limit the spillover of that. But instead, I think really the escalatory decision-making here continues to rest with the Israelis. Are they going to continue to press their advantages now, or do they think this is enough?